All right, so I'm going to tell you two things. The first is to just let you know how hard I work to get these out, and the second is just something kind of goofy. So I'm actually re-recording this because 7 minutes into recording this section, my computer had become unplugged from its charger and died. And unfortunately, the webcam kind of froze and I wasn't able to continue recording. So this is me having to throw out the old video and start over. Just letting you know, this is what I do for y'all. Second of all, if this were green, I would be Yoda. Because I like the ears. Like, it's Yoda ears. It's not a dog. All right, so let me try this again. We're going to try this again and see if it works. But we're going to move on to talk about drugs and substance disorders. And you might be, or substance use disorders or substance abuse. You might be kind of surprised that we're kind of talking about drugs here, because when we talk about drugs, we tend to talk about how they are biological or physiological in nature. But the thing is that drugs can affect your brain. Now, certainly not all drugs affect your brain. Ibuprofen doesn't really affect your brain, but other types of drugs do. And this means that they are going to affect your mood, your perception, your behavior. Additionally, in addition to drugs having these kind of psychological effects, drug use occurs in certain environments. They may happen due to stress. They may happen for a variety of different reasons. And maybe there are some psychological things that are going on that make substance abuse more likely to happen. Because psychological disorders are biopsychosocial issues and substance abuse as well, it stands to reason that substance use disorders should actually be included in the DSM-5. So we're going to talk about them now. So substance-related disorders or substance abuse is basically a maladaptive pattern of substance use. So if you need to be able to function at work and you basically have a beer every morning before you go to work to be able to function, that would probably be considered a maladaptive pattern of use. So we're not talking about occasionally going to happy hour and having a beer. We are talking about something that is starting to affect your social life, your work life, and just your general well-being. And it will lead to clinically significant impairment as well as distress. And again, if not for you, then for somebody else. Now, when we talk about substance use, we are talking about psychoactive drugs. These are drugs that actually cross through the blood-brain barrier, interact with neurotransmitters in the brain, and actually alter perception and mood. So that'll include things like marijuana, cocaine, caffeine, alcohol, and so on. So how does addiction and substance use disorder happen? So one of the things that we find with repeated use of taking a drug is that your body gets better at breaking it down in a variety of ways. And so what ends up happening is that for you to get the effect that you want, whether that is a burst of energy, a relaxing feeling, or pain relief, it means that you're going to have to take more of that drug to get that effect. And this is what's known as tolerance. So it's basically a diminishing effect of the same dose of a drug with repeated use. So here we can see that over time, as you take more of a drug, you're going to need to take a larger dose to get the same effect you did the first time you took it. So what ends up happening is, despite the fact that your brain and body are still being affected and you're taking more drug, what will end up happening is that you'll have to take more. This can be really dangerous for a couple of different reasons. It can lead to dependence, where you need that drug to be able to function either psychologically or biologically. A lot of drugs produce painful, potentially even dangerous withdrawal symptoms, so you're going to take more of that drug to fight off withdrawal. The other reason that it can be really, really dangerous is that, especially with drugs like alcohol, opioids, and other types of depressants, the more that you take, the greater risk you're running to basically develop respiratory depression. A lot of drugs like alcohol and opioids basically slow your body down. which means they can also slow down your breathing to the point where breathing, you're just not capable of it. So the more that you take of these drugs, the greater risk you're running of overdosing, and that can be really dangerous too. So generally drugs tend to come in 3 different classes, and I'm oversimplifying this. If you want to learn more, I teach a drugs and behavior class every fall where we talk about drugs and drug abuse in detail. We largely have depressants like alcohol, opioids, and they basically kind of slow your body down, they slow your brain down. They're very, very inhibitory. We have stimulants that'll include things like nicotine, caffeine, cocaine, amphetamines, meth, and other drugs like that. They basically give your body a lot of energy. They activate the sympathetic nervous system. Now, they don't all work on the same mechanisms. They work on different types of neurotransmitters in different parts of the brain, but they're basically designed to give you energy. Drugs like LSD, magic mushrooms, and things like that are classified as hallucinogens. They produce things like hallucinations, altered sensations, and sometimes marijuana gets lumped in there, but marijuana is not a hallucinogen. It is a cannabinoid. And how it works is a little bit different than how hallucinogens work. So what are depressants? Depressants are basically drugs that calm neural activity and slow down body function. As I've mentioned, this will include alcohol. This will include barbiturates, which are, and that should be barbiturates. I don't know how to pronounce it correctly, clearly, but it should be barbiturates. And that will include tranquilizers like phenobarbital, amytal. Oftentimes these are used as anticonvulsant drugs or anesthetics for surgery. So they are hardcore. And then we have opiates that will include things like morphine, heroin, oxycodone, fentanyl, and so on. Stimulants are drugs that basically excite neural activity and speed up bodily functions. That will include things like caffeine, nicotine, cocaine, ecstasy, or Molly. Interestingly enough, ecstasy or MDMA also has some properties that make it kind of a hallucinogen, but kind of a stimulant. Meth and amphetamines, which are known as speed. And then hallucinogens are generally not addictive. They're not habit forming the way that stimulants or certain types of depressants are. They will often distort perception and evoke sensations with no input. This can include LSD. Marijuana can occasionally produce hallucinations, but very rarely. And I'm only lumping it here because I don't have enough time to talk about cannabinoids, and then certain types of psychotropic mushrooms. You can read more in your book about each of these different types of drugs, and I would, because they will pop up on your 4th exam and potentially on your final. So now we're going to move on to probably talking about a disorder that many of you, if you do not know somebody with, you probably might have it yourself. And these are what are known as mood disorders. So mood disorders are disorders that are largely characterized by emotional extremes, either extreme up kind of energy or extremely low energy and low mood. And so there are other types of mood disorders out there, including postpartum depression, as well as seasonal affective disorder, when we tend to feel a little bit more depressed in the wintertime because we're getting less sunlight. But by and large, we're going to focus on major depressive disorder and bipolar disorder. So to be diagnosed with major depressive disorder, you have to have at least 2 or more weeks, just 2 weeks of depressed mood, feeling worthless, loss of interest or pleasures in activity, changes in sleeping behaviors, either sleeping too little or sleeping too much, changes in eating behaviors, either eating too little or eating too much, it can't be due to a medical condition such as a terminal illness like cancer, and it can't be due to drugs of any kind. Depression is the biggest reason for seeking mental health services. Now, one thing that I will mention is that spontaneous remission, getting better, and not necessarily being cured, but no longer feeling depressed, is something that will eventually happen on its own. It does eventually reverse. But if you're struggling with this, I would definitely encourage you to talk to somebody, because even though the depression will eventually go away on its own, having better coping mechanisms to deal with it and possibly speeding up that reversal can be incredibly helpful. Now, one of the things that you might think is interesting, and I have never myself struggled with depression. I've had a couple of times where I thought I might be slipping into it. But for those who may never have struggled with depression, you may feel like it's just feeling sad. For somebody who actually struggles with depression, it's much more like an emotional numbing of sorts. So the writer and webcomic artist Ali Broche, who wrote the webcomic Hyperbole and a Half many years ago, actually talked about her struggle with depression. And I thought it was very interesting. And as somebody who had never really struggled with it, it really kind of opened my eyes and made me a lot more thoughtful about how I talk about depression with students. And when students are telling me that they're struggling with depression, I try to approach it in a different way. So here's kind of a quote. You don't need to write this down, but I think this is very, very illuminating. At first, I try to explain that it's not really negativity or sadness anymore. It's more just this detached, meaningless fog where you can't feel anything about anything, even the things you love, even fun things. And you're horribly bored and lonely, but since you've lost your ability to connect with any of the things that would normally make you feel less bored and lonely, you're stuck in the boring, lonely, meaningless void without anything to distract you from how boring, lonely, and meaningless it is. So I think that this is really helpful, and I would encourage you, if you know somebody who is struggling with this, be gentle with them. I would not tell them to cheer up or snap out of it. I find that those kind of responses are not helpful. What they want is somebody to listen. People need to feel like they're being heard, even if you don't understand, and they want to know that you're here for them, even if they're behaving in ways that feel like they're trying to distance from you. So bipolar disorder is going to be a little bit different. So bipolar disorder has periods of depression, so very similar to what we would see with major depressive disorder, but these are going to alternate with periods of mania. Now, if you're thinking that mania is just feeling happy, it's really not that. Like, you can look at brain scans of people in the middle of a manic episode, either a PET scan or an MRI scan, and their brain is just ridiculously active. Mania is not about being happy. It's about having a lot of extra energy. There's just an air of overexcitability. And it's not something that is common. So in terms of it's out of character for this person. So we're going to see things like overexcitability, impulsivity. This could include things like pathological gambling, risk-taking behaviors like promiscuous sex, taking a lot of drugs, shopping binges, food binges, etc. Highly elevated mood, but a massive amount of irritability. These people are not happy. They are happy with an edge. And what's actually kind of interesting is that major depressive disorder is more common in women, but bipolar disorder is equally common between men and women. One of the things that we know, and it's kind of interesting, is that oftentimes when you see an even split between men and women, that probably suggests that the disorder has a very, very strong genetic link. And additionally, bipolar disorder comes in two different forms. So there's bipolar type 1, which is marked with periods of depression and mania. And then bipolar type 2 has those depressive episodes, but the manic episodes are kind of lower. It's what's referred to as hypomania. So for people with bipolar disorder type 2, they don't really get the highs like somebody with bipolar type 1 will do. And the thing is that people like their manic episodes. They get a lot of work done. They're very, very productive. And so one of the things that's really critical for somebody with bipolar disorder is if they're on meds, making sure they take them. Because the meds may take the manic episodes away, and people might be worried that they won't be as productive or as energetic as they would be if they were having those manic episodes. So medication compliance is really critical. So what do you need to know about mood disorders? One of the things that we know is that depression and depressive episodes ultimately change your thoughts and behavior. These people tend to see the world through a darker lens. Now, one of the things that's actually kind of interesting, the phrase that we sometimes use is sadder but wiser. They are able to make more accurate assessments of themselves and other people than people who are not struggling with depression. People who are not depressed tend to engage in more self-serving biases and that extreme optimism about the self. And people with depression they see things clearly, but they also see things very, very darkly. And one of the things we'll talk about very soon is that the way that you see the world when you're depressed ultimately changes your thoughts and it changes your behavior, and it creates this vicious cycle that can be very difficult to break out of. Depression is not a culture-bound disorder. This is something that happens across the globe. And generally what we're going to find for a lot of people is that this is going to be triggered by stress. It typically does not come out of nowhere. So what are some other things that we know? Generally, people with depression tend to take a very, very negative view of things. They have what is called a negative explanatory style. And what's more, they tend to be the type of people who will dwell on those negative things. This dwelling is referred to as rumination. You are going to sit there and overthink about these past events that make you sad. Have you ever walked out of those situations feeling better? Probably not. One of the things that we know, and we're not quite sure why this is, it might be a socialization aspect. Women are more prone to rumination than men are. And because of that, it's part of the reason why women might be a bit more susceptible to developing depression as a result. Now let's get back to this negative explanatory style. Now, one of the things that we find is that people with depression tend to have what we call an internal, stable, and global outlook. So think about what happens when bad things happen. Somebody with depression, when they have something bad happen, they're going to have an internal focus rather than an external focus. So what do I mean by internal focus? This bad thing happened because it was my fault. Versus an external focus, which is this happened because of somebody else, or I did the best I could, there's nothing I could have done about this. But rather the internal is it's my fault. External is it's outside of me. Stable is I will always be this way. So let's say that you did poorly on an exam. Somebody with a stable outlook is going to basically say, I'm a failure and I always will be. Somebody with the opposite of that is going to have an outlook that's basically, yeah, I failed on this, but I don't fail on everything. So this is stable. It's always going to be this way. I'm always going to be a failure. Compare that to somebody else who basically is like, this is temporary. So we have internal, when external would probably be more helpful. Stable, when temporary, would probably be more helpful. And they're going to be global about this. So when something bad happens to them, They're going to be like, bad things always happen to me. I fail at everything I do, rather than focusing on, yeah, this bad thing happened, but I've got other good things going on in my life. So internal, it's my fault. Stable, it's always going to be this way. It will always be like this. And global, this bad thing is everything. So I'm a failure. I did poorly on the test because I'm a failure. I will always be a failure, and I will always be a failure at everything I try. Can you kind of see why with that negative explanatory style, why it might be hard to break out of that cycle of depression? So depression can absolutely be a cycle due to this negative explanatory style. So think about it. So stressful things happen. Somebody who's prone to depression is going to have that negative explanatory style. That's going to create a depressed mood, and that's going to lead to cognitive or behavioral changes. Maybe these people will have low self-esteem. They'll beat themselves up. Other people may not necessarily want to be around that, or they'll push people away, or they'll withdraw, or they won't call anybody, or they won't do the things that make them feel better. And that leads to more stress, which leads to explaining away the stress with your negative explanatory style, which leads to a depressed mood, which leads to those cognitive and behavioral changes, and the cycle continues. So we have one more thing that I want to talk about. We're going to talk about schizophrenia. So I want to be very, very clear about one thing. Schizophrenia and multiple personality disorder or dissociative identity disorder are different things. Schizophrenia is not about having alternating personalities. Schizophrenia is basically having difficulty staying in reality. So schizophrenia comes from the Greek for split mind. So let's talk a little bit about some of the common symptoms of schizophrenia. So these will include disordered thinking, which we'll talk about very soon. This might include delusions. So feeling like everybody's out to get you, that the television is trying to control you. Disturbed perceptions, such as hallucinations. Typically, those hallucinations are going to be auditory in nature. And then inappropriate emotions and actions. So that could be not displaying emotions when you should be displaying emotions, or displaying inappropriate emotions when you really shouldn't. So let's talk about each of these. So when we talk about schizophrenia, there are two major classes of symptoms. So when we have positive symptoms, that means that inappropriate behaviors are present. So that will include hallucinations. Typically, auditory hallucinations will be related to things like negative self-talk, like a disembodied voice basically saying that you're stupid, that you have to watch out for people, that the television's trying to control you. So those kind of hallucinations. And then delusions, waking up and believing that you are the king of the universe and it's your job to save the world from the aliens that are coming tomorrow. And they genuinely believe this. So these are inappropriate and they're present. Negative symptoms are when actions or feelings are unexpectedly absent. So for example, having what we call flat affect, having a voice with no tone, no emotional tone, no rising and falling of my voice based on the emotions that I have. They'll talk about something that's very, very painful for them, and that really painful thing happened to me, and it happened like this. Like, they have no tone. They do not display emotion in their voice, and their face shows no emotional expression. And that's what flat affect is. That can also be, we can also have things like anhedonia, which basically means no pleasure in things, or avolition, basically no will, not wanting to get up and do things. Or catatonia, basically being catatonic and not responding to anything. The onset is actually kind of interesting. It strikes in young adulthood. That's especially true for males with schizophrenia. For females with schizophrenia, it actually tends to spike in two places. Young adulthood is one, and then there's another spike around menopause, suggesting that it might be due to hormonal changes. This is something that can develop gradually, or it can be sudden, which we would potentially call a psychotic break. Generally, we know that recovery is a lot harder if it's gradual. So here's what we know about schizophrenia. Now, in biopsych, I'm going to talk about this in more detail, but here's the basics of what you need to know. We know that compared to people without schizophrenia, people who have schizophrenia have a lot of extra dopamine receptors in the brain, especially in areas like the amygdala and the thalamus. They actually have lower activity in the frontal lobe, which is really important, and it might explain why they feel somewhat untethered from reality. Typically, we will find that they have abnormally low brain activity, particularly in the frontal lobe, and rapid shrinkage. And in contrast, the thalamus and the amygdala are actually overactive, and this might explain why we have things like hallucinations and these delusions with extreme negative content, such as delusions of grandeur, delusions of persecution, delusions of control. And genetics also plays a role here. We actually find that there is a strong genetic link here. It tends to run in families, and we do find that if an identical twin has schizophrenia, odds are pretty good that the other twin will develop schizophrenia. And it's been argued that that's because they share the same fetal environment and they share a placenta. And it turns out that the prenatal environment may also hold a clue. There's been this theory that part of the reason that schizophrenia happens is that as a fetus is developing, it contracts a virus in utero, which disrupts the prenatal environment and thus could lead to the development of schizophrenia later. Research has actually found that you tend to find a lot more people developing schizophrenia if they were born during the time of a flu epidemic, or if their mother had the flu while they were pregnant with the child. Additionally, we also know that kind of fits with this virus theory. We do know that schizophrenia is more common in urban, dense populations than it is in rural areas. And that's because, and I think we've learned this year, when you're in areas where you have large crowds of people and not a lot of opportunity for space, that gives viruses an opportunity to really spread in a way that they can't in a less sparsely populated area. Additionally, your birth month matters. For those of you that were born during the winter months, particularly February and March, you actually have an increased risk of schizophrenia. And part of the reason for that is that usually during the second trimester for a fetus that is developing, somebody who is basically born in February or March, they were basically developing during flu season in those critical second and third trimester months. And so we actually find that if you're born in the summer months, you're actually less likely to develop schizophrenia. And we find that this trend reverses itself in the southern hemisphere because our winter is their summer. So during our summer, that's their winter, and we see a very, very similar pattern. So it is entirely possible that catching a virus while developing in the womb could potentially lead to schizophrenia. So I'm going to basically finish up. Your book talks about antisocial personality disorder more, but I want to finish by talking about personality disorders because I think they're kind of interesting. They're really, really hard to diagnose because whereas some of the major disorders that we've talked about here are kind of out of character sort of things, this is absolutely tied to your personality, which makes it harder to manage. So personality disorders will often happen. They include inflexible and enduring behavior patterns, and they will often interfere with social interactions. Now, because this is tied to personality, they can be really, really difficult to treat. Additionally, due to the nature of that particular personality disorder, it can also be really difficult to treat. If you've got somebody with narcissistic personality disorder, you're never going to treat them. You know why? Because they don't think they have the problem. They think the problem's with everybody else. So these can be really, really hard to treat. So we're going to start by talking about cluster A. Hello, Sherlock. We're going to talk about the odd disorders. So we have things like paranoid personality disorder, which includes irrational suspicion and mistrust of others. Schizoid personality disorders, which may be a lack of interest or detachment from others, as well as a restricted emotional expression. And I don't know what disorder. I know that Sherlock says he's a high-functioning sociopath, but I would actually say he's definitely one of these cluster A's. Schizotypal personality disorder is marked by discomfort with social interaction, along with distorted thoughts and patterns, along with magical thinking. This is Blanche Dubois from A Streetcar Named Desire. Blanche likes to live in a very big fantasy world, and she's very, very dramatic and loves to flirt with men. She would definitely be what we would call a cluster B personality disorder. And you'll notice that I am analyzing fictitious characters. Don't do this with real life people. You're like, even I'm not a therapist, but I noticed some hallmarks of these fictitious characters with these disorders. So we have antisocial personality disorder, which your book talks about more. These people disregard and violate the rights of others. They tend to have a lack of empathy. We have borderline personality disorder. This one tends to be overdiagnosed in men and underdiagnosed in women. This is basically borderline personality disorder is kind of the reverse. These people have pervasive instability. They don't really have a sense of self. Their sense of self is basically kind of based on what other people tell them. They also have, they may potentially self-harm. They may engage in impulsive behavior, and they have a very classic fear of abandonment. Histrionic personality disorder includes attention-seeking behavior, that may also include sex or flirtation, as well as excessive emotion. And then narcissistic personality disorder, a very grandiose sense of self and a strong need for admiration and a lack of empathy for other people. And then finally, cluster C are anxious or are fearful disorders. Really good examples of this would be people like, if you've ever watched The Odd Couple, Felix Unger probably has obsessive compulsive personality disorder because he loves to clean everything. So these are anxious or fearful disorders. That can include avoidant personality disorder, which is pervasive social inhibition and a feeling of inadequacy, being very, very sensitive to negative criticism, but they don't really want to be around people. Dependent personality disorder, having a very strong need to be cared for by others, and obsessive compulsive personality disorder. So by the way, being neat and tidy is not a hallmark of OCD. It is, however, potentially OCPD. So this involves rigid conformity to rules, emphasis on perfection, cleanliness, and control. So what about psychopaths? Why haven't I talked about psychopaths? We often assume that psychopathy is assumed to be antisocial personality disorder. Psychopaths will typically, when we talk about psychopathy or sociopathy, we tend to focus on personality traits, but APD is more interested in behavior. Psychopathy is often marked by superficial charm, shallow, glib emotions that are very, very surface, impulsivity, and lack of empathy.
And interestingly enough, a lot of very socially successful or financially successful people can be psychopaths because they're really good at persuading people and charming people. So folks, this is all that I had. We are pretty much done with the semester. If you have any questions or you want to learn more about some of these disorders, feel free to email me, and have a wonderful semester. If I don't see you for the final review, the fourth exam review session or the final review session, have a wonderful winter break. Take care of yourselves. Make good choices. We see some light at the end of the tunnel. We just need to dig a little bit deeper, and I will see you later. Bye, everybody.